Ask someone why they work and the answer comes quickly. Because I need money, because I have bills, because I have a family to feed. The answer is so immediate, so obvious that the question feels almost stupid for being asked. Of course you work, everyone works. That's just how life is. But that quickness, that obviousness, that is exactly where the looking needs to begin. Because when an answer arrives that fast, it usually means the question hasn't actually been heard. The mind reaches for the nearest available explanation and hands it over before the question has had time to land. And the nearest available explanation is almost always the one the surrounding culture handed you before you were old enough to question it. So hear the question again, without rushing to answer it. Why do you work? Not why do humans work in general. Why do you, this particular person, spend the majority of your waking hours doing something that someone else has defined in exchange for numbers that appear in an account? Why is this the shape of a human life in the world as it currently exists? Was it always this way? Does it have to be this way? And what is actually happening underneath the paycheck, underneath the career, underneath the productivity when a human being sells their time? Start at the beginning. For most of human history, work was not something you went to. It was something you did, embedded in the fabric of staying alive. You grew food because you needed to eat. You built because you needed shelter. You made clothing because the cold was real. The work and the life were not separate things. There was no commute. There was no employer. There was no salary. There was the day and what the day required, and you met it directly. This does not mean that life was simple or that it was good. It was often brutal. Drought meant starvation. A bad winter could kill. The body was always one misfortune away from disaster, but the relationship between work and its purpose was transparent. You could see exactly why you were doing what you were doing. The grain you grew was the grain you ate. The house you built was the house you slept in. The connection between effort and meaning was immediate and visible. Then that connection was broken, and the breaking of it is the whole story of modern economic life. It didn't break all at once. It broke slowly, over centuries, through a series of changes that each seemed reasonable in isolation, and that together produced something no one had planned, and most people have never fully examined. Land that communities had worked in common was enclosed and declared private property. People who had fed themselves from that land were suddenly without the means to do so. They moved to cities. They entered factories. And for the first time in human history on a massive scale, people worked not to produce things for themselves, but to produce things for someone else, in exchange for wages, which they then used to buy the things they needed from other people who were also working for wages. The loop closed on itself. Work became separated from its product. The baker no longer ate what he baked. The weaver no longer wore what she wove. Everything passed through the medium of money first, and money was controlled by those who owned the means of production. The factory, the land, the machinery, the capital. This is the structure you were born into. You did not design it. You did not choose it. You arrived in a world where this arrangement was already old, already normalized, already invisible, because it had been present long enough to seem like nature rather than history. And so the question of why you work has, for most people, a practical answer and a deeper answer that is rarely examined. The practical answer is correct as far as it goes. You work because you need money, and you need money because the things required to live, food, shelter, clothing, healthcare, education, are all priced. You cannot drink from a river in most cities. You cannot grow food on land you don't own. You cannot build a shelter without owning land, buying materials, navigating permits. The entire surface of livable reality has been priced, and to access any of it, you need the token. And to get the token, you work. This is not a conspiracy. It is not the result of any single evil decision. It is the cumulative outcome of thousands of years of arrangements around property and exchange that have solidified into what feels like the natural order of things. But it is not natural. It is historical, and what is historical could, in principle, have been otherwise. Now look at something more subtle, because not all work is the same. And the reason people work is not only economic, and the confusion between these things produces much of the suffering that surrounds the subject. There is work that a person would do whether or not they were paid. The scientist who cannot stop thinking about the problem. The musician who plays in an empty room. The person who cooks not because they have to, but because something in the process of preparing food for others satisfies something deep. This kind of work is not really about money. Money may be involved, and money may be necessary for the person to survive while doing it, but the animating force is something else. Call it meaning. Call it expression. Call it the organism doing what it is suited to do, the way water flows downhill not because it is trying to, but because that is its nature. And then there is work that no one would do freely. The assembly line, the call center, the repetitive extraction of a person's time and attention for someone else's profit. Work that depletes rather than fulfills. Work where the human being is essentially a component in a machine, replaceable and interchangeable, valued not as a person, but as a unit of labor. This work is done entirely because the alternative is to not eat. It is survival, nothing more. Most people's working lives contain both, in different proportions, and the proportion matters enormously to whether a life feels livable or like a slow drain. The economic system does not distinguish between these two. It measures both in the same unit: hours, wages, output, GDP. The joy of the craftsman and the deadness of the assembly worker both appear the same in the data. Both are counted as economic activity. Both contribute to growth. The interior quality of the experience, what it does to the human being undergoing it, is simply not part of the calculation. And this is not an accident. The system was not built to optimize for human experience. It was built to optimize for production and exchange. Those are not the same thing. And mistaking them for the same thing is the source of enormous confusion about why economic growth keeps rising, and yet large numbers of people feel that something is wrong with their lives. Something is wrong. The measurement is measuring the wrong thing. Now go further. Because there is a dimension of work that is almost never discussed in economics, and that may be the most important of all. Work is how most humans in the modern world construct their identity. Ask someone who they are, and within seconds they will tell you what they do. I am a teacher. I am an engineer. I am a doctor. The doing has become the being. The function has become the self. And this merger of identity with occupation has consequences that run very deep. When what you do and who you are become the same thing, losing your job is not just an economic event. It is an existential one. Retirement is not just the end of a career. For many people, it is the collapse of the structure around which their sense of self was organized. Burnout is not just tiredness. It is the discovery that the self you built through work has no ground beneath it once the work stops. None of this was inevitable. In other cultures and other times, a person's identity was organized around family, around community, around spiritual practice, around place. Work was part of life, but not the center of it. The centering of identity on occupation is a modern phenomenon, and it is partly what makes the economic system so total in its reach. When your work is your identity, you will defend the conditions of your work, even when those conditions diminish you. You will accept the terms of employment not just because you need money, but because questioning those terms feels like a threat to who you are. The system benefits from this confusion. An employee who has built their self-image around their role is easier to manage than one who sees their work clearly for what it is, an exchange of time for money, neither more nor less, valuable instrumentally and not definitionally. So why do you work? You work because the structure of the world as currently organized requires money to access the basics of life, and working is how most people get money. That is the true and simple answer at the economic level. But underneath that, you may also work because it gives shape to your days, because it connects you to other people, because it expresses something in you that wants to be expressed, because it makes you feel useful, because it quiets something that would otherwise be loud in you if you were still. And the question worth sitting with, not to answer quickly but to actually live with, is this: which of those reasons are yours genuinely, and which were handed to you before you were old enough to ask? Because the person who knows why they actually work is in a fundamentally different relationship to their economic life than the person who has simply never stopped long enough to ask.